When dealing with a property in Baltimore City, it's important to know whether or not that lot is subject to ground rent. Now, ground rent is a bit of a historical quirk. It goes back to the colonial era and is really only an issue in Baltimore City and exists almost nowhere else in the country. Basically, it's a bit of a historical holdover whereby some person has a lease interest in the actual land under the improved house. So these leases were written in such a way they usually last 99 years with perpetual renewals. It's often for a small-ish amount of money, usually between $100 and $150, and that'll be paid often in half-yearly installments. So as we go through this document, the seller is required to provide a lot of information about this ground lease. So first, they need to say how much the rent is for, when the next due date is, and importantly, who to actually send the check to. So they need to provide the contact information for the leaseholder. Now, like any other lease, buyers are obligated to pay this rent amount. And if you fail to pay on time, the ground lease holder may take action to collect past due ground rent. They also have potentially a foreclosure interest in the property. If you fall behind too much, they could actually file a foreclosure action and sell the property in order to collect their deficiency. Now, there are certain restrictions on what ground lease holders can actually do. For instance, they cannot demand more than 3 years of past due ground rent. But regardless, if you fall behind on these payments, you're encouraged to ask a lawyer for advice on any available defenses. If the concept of a ground rent is not acceptable to your buyer, they actually have a right to redeem the ground rent. So you would basically purchase the ground lease from the ground lease holder and obtain absolute ownership of the property. For the actual amount for redemption, you'd have to reach out to the ground lease holder. It is generally set at a fixed amount, which you can potentially negotiate with that leaseholder. You'll have to figure out on a case-by-case basis if it makes sense to pay the annual fee or if they would prefer to redeem the ground rent outright. That would be a personal decision that the buyer has to make. Potentially, if the buyer intends to live at the property for a very, very long time, it may make sense to redeem the ground rent outright as opposed to paying the ongoing fees. But that is a financial and personal decision for the buyer. Ultimately, ground rent is just a very odd situation in Baltimore. People have a lot of questions about it. Ultimately, it is something that's extremely normal and common in Baltimore City. It does not impact the buyer's rights to modify the house or the grounds surrounding the house, so long as they remain current on their ground rent payments. It is otherwise just like any other form of ownership.